Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to this June 11, 2014 edition, June 11, 2014 edition of Nightcast. Friends, tonight, as many as 500,000 people have been forced to flee the Iraqi city of Mosul after Islamist militants effectively took control of it. And they've actually moved on to another city now tonight too. But this will be our opening story. Several stories related to the tragic situation going on now in Iraq.
The exodus from Mosul goes on. These dramatic pictures from the Tigris River show civilians fleeing, fighting on the other side. Perhaps as many as 500,000 people have now left Iraq's second largest city. Roads are clogged as families seek shelter in nearby Kurdish areas. In Mosul itself, the smouldering aftermath of a battle that didn't take long. The militants attacked just 5 days ago. On Monday, the provincial governor urged residents to hold firm. Hours later, he was gone. Iraq's outgunned security forces weren't far behind. Militants now control government offices and banks too.
Today we are dealing with the situation. We are not going to allow this to carry on, irrespective of the price.
In January, another major city, Fallujah, fell to the same hardline group, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. The government has tried and failed to take it back. Tens of thousands of people have fled. ISIS now controls a broad swathe of territory across the Middle East. In Iraq's Anbar province, Fallujah is still in rebel hands, and there's been fighting in Ramadi too. In Syria, the group is involved in fighting in Aleppo and has a regional base in Raqqa. And now, in a dramatic extension of their influence, they have Mosul too.
This group of people now, there's tens of thousands of these guys, and they now have a territory. They control territory, they control border crossing points, they control oil resources, mineral resources, trade, income. They have a base in the middle of the Middle East.
In Syria, ISIS has waged a savage campaign against Shia Muslims and Christians, part of its wider effort to create an Islamic state. It's made extensive use of foreign fighters, including some of the hundreds of young British Muslims who've gone out to fight. Back in Iraq, the government is struggling to respond. Overnight, there were clashes in Baiji, whose major oil refinery supplies much of the country. These unverified pictures appear to show fighting before the militants reportedly withdrew. With hundreds of thousands of Iraqis once more on the move, it's clear the country is now in the grip of a crisis as bad as anything since American forces left 3 years ago. Paul Adams, BBC News.
And, for instance, that report came out. I have an update. That was filed a few hours ago. I have an update filed just 45 minutes ago showing that Islamist insurgents in Iraq have seized the city of Tikrit, with their second major gain after capturing Mosul yesterday. And Tikrit is the hometown of the former leader Saddam Hussein. It lies about 95 miles, that'd be 150 kilometers north of the capital, Baghdad. Now, the Iraqi prime minister has vowed to fight back. There are even some news stories saying the United States is going to help. Of course, you know, friends, we know the United States has been saying it's going to do a lot of things that never happen. But the insurgents are from the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. ISIS in some... It's also known as ISIL. Now, the ISIS, interestingly, that's Sisi spelled backward, isn't it? I think. Shouldn't be any relation, though. That's just a wild thought just popped in my head. This next report, friends, has some video that could be a little shocking. You'll hear another warning as it opens. Paul Wood will give this report showing the additional gains that the insurgents have made.
The following report contains some disturbing images.
The speed of the jihadis' advance has shocked the Iraqi government and its Western allies. This is the road to Tikrit, the town ISIS has now seized by some accounts. ISIS called it a blessed invasion. We will not stop, they say. All this after the prize of Mosul fell into the jihadis' hands. Their black flag now flies over Iraq's second city with 2 million people. These tanks have been burnt, and Mosul is now under our control, says an ISIS fighter. An ISIS propaganda video seeks to explain such breathtaking gains. An ambush. The targets are said to be soldiers returning from leave. It's a brutally efficient campaign that has sown terror among government supporters. We can't show much of what's on this video. The jihadis even have their own checkpoints. They have lists with the names of the security forces and officials. In this way, ISIS has been steadily tightening their grip in the north and west of Iraq. A terrified man is led away to be killed. People arrive in Kurdish territory exhausted and demoralised. Getting out of Mosul has been a harrowing experience. There were bodies on the roads and rumours of summary executions by the jihadis. But they are not here only because of ISIS. People here have spoken of a complete collapse in the security forces inside Mosul, of policemen and soldiers simply abandoning their posts and fleeing along with everyone else. And people have come here because they're afraid not just of ISIS, but afraid of what happens next, of what the Iraqi government might have to do to get Mosul back from the jihadis. This woman tells me the jihadis told people they had nothing to fear from them. We left because of al-Maliki, the Prime Minister, she says. He's going to bombard Mosul using warplanes. And indeed, Iraq's Prime Minister has promised that the jihadi victory in Mosul will not stand.
We are dealing with the situation. We are not going to allow this to carry on, regardless of the price. We are getting ready. We are organizing.
The roads into Kurdish territory are choked. A few miles back lies the beginnings of the Islamic State ISIS hopes to carve out from Iraq and Syria. The battle to prevent such a state coming into being will be a bloody one. Many more people will flee their homes before it's over. Paul Wood, BBC News in northern Iraq.
Okay, thank you, Paul Wood. ISIS, which again, friends, is also known as ISIL, I guess that would be ISIL, is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. It controls considerable territory in eastern Syria and western and central Iraq. You know, most of western Iraq is desert. And I'll show you a map after this next story that shows you how most of the western area from Mosul is an area called Nineveh. And I've got about 8 or 10 scriptures from the Bible to share with you related to Nineveh. Because Nineveh, a great city that goes way back to the Bible, to the time of Asher, right back to Genesis 10, 10th chapter of Genesis. And Jonah was sent there. We'll show you scriptures on that. But at that time, Nineveh repented. Later, though, different story, and now it's a big desert wilderness because of the later story. We'll get to that in a moment. But the present situation, the ISIS or ISIL controls considerable territory, as you've heard in these videos, in the eastern Syria and western and central Iraq, in a campaign to set up a Sunni militant enclave straddling the border. There were reports earlier today of fighting further south in Samarra, 110 kilometers north of Baghdad. Separately, at least 21 people were killed and 45 hurt by a suicide bomber at a Shia meeting in Baghdad, police said. As many as we reported earlier, I mentioned this earlier, as many as 500,000 people fled Mosul after the militants attacked the city. The head of the Turkish mission in Mosul and almost 50 consulate staff are being held by the militants, according to the Turkish officials. Turkey's foreign minister warned there would be a harsh retaliation if any of its citizens were harmed. Okay, those are some update notes I have, friends. Now, in this next video, who are Iraq's ISIS fighters? In less than 1 week, the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham's ISIS has seized control of the western half of Mosul, Iraq's second largest city and a major political and economic center. Hundreds of ISIS fighters fought their way from the desert suburbs into the city center, overrunning government buildings, television stations, and the international airport, despite being outnumbered by the country's security forces by more than 15 to 1. But who are the fighters who make up ISIS, and what are their aims? I'm hoping this report from James Robert is going to come up and play. A very tragic situation happening right now in Iraq could really change things over there, because one of the goals of ISIS is to is to create a vast Palestinian state that would include Israel. So this thing, wow. Like I said last night, if the way things are coming together, we don't enter into the fifth seal this year, it'll only be because God has decided to delay things, friends, as he did for a couple decades. And he's had a reason for that. I'm not sure if I know why, but some people think it might be because of you and me, those who God has called to be part of his elect. But I've got a couple of maps we can take a quick look at here. You can see in Iraq, the colored areas are Iraq, and up toward the north is Mosul, the little red dot there up toward the north, and then just below that you see a wide desert area, Nineveh. And of course, Iraq is in between. Syria is on the west side of Iraq, and Iran is on the east side of Iraq. Excuse me, friends. And I've got another map. Let's take a look at this. This map just shows some the population around there. And my Bible scriptures are below a couple stories. Now, I'm hoping that our video player is not going to freeze up when I try to go down to those Bible scriptures and then come back. Oh, now listen, last night, let me tell you real quick, we'll go to the Bible scriptures. Let me bring up a full screen of Reuven Rivlin, the new newly elected president-elect of Israel. He'll be the 10th president of Israel after Shimon Peres leaves office on July 26. I didn't have his picture available last night, but I've got it in the right place so I can show that to you here tonight. That's new Israeli president, 10th president of Israel, again to take office after Shimon Peres leaves on July 26, after his term expires July 26. Rivlin. And then here's a picture of the Prime Minister of Israel congratulating Mr. Rivlin yesterday after the voting, and that makes him the new president-elect, 10th president of Israel. Okay, now I've got, we'll come back and mention that. Yes, Hilary Clinton was in the news yesterday, and she was interviewed, and kind of a funny picture with one news story that goes, that asks about, well, we'll come back to that too. In fact, I think I'm going to save that till tomorrow. I want to cover this and then cover those stories, and then that's about all the time we're going to have. Beginning in Genesis 10, verse 11, friends, there's a first mention of Nineveh, where God says, "Out of that land went forth Asher, and builded Nineveh, and the city of Rehoboth and Calah." Excuse me, the city of Nineveh was built by Asher, and then Isaiah 37:37 shows how great a city it became. Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, went and dwelt at Nineveh at one time, and then God sends Jonah to give a warning to Nineveh, and as it says here in Jonah 1 verse 2, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city." Nineveh was a great city, "and cry against it, for their wickedness is come up before me." And must have been some pretty mean wickedness of the type of maybe even Sodom and Gomorrah, if it comes up before God, the way the verse mentions it here. And as many of you know, Jonah ducked out at first, but then we won't go through the story of Jonah and the great fish, but after a little correction by God, Jonah then decided, okay, he arose and went into Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceeding great city of 3 days' journey. Excuse me, friends, the journey is about 20 miles. So the width of Nineveh is a city about 60 miles wide, and a great city. And let's see, our next verse. "And Jonah began to, he went about a day's journey, he went about 20 miles into the city, and he cried and said, 'Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown.'" So God was giving Nineveh an opportunity and time to repent. The warning was 40 days. Well, the people of Nineveh, according to the next verse, verse 5 of Jonah 3, they believed God and proclaimed a fast and put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them even to the least of them. Now, friends, what if a prophet came, God sent a prophet today into the United States and told them that they are being extremely wicked? For example, let's say they were warned that the dissanctification of marriage by opening it up to the same sex, when God says marriage is between a man and a woman, and you're desecrating the sacraments of God when you do these perversions. Now, what if a prophet came in and said, "Be warned, God is going to destroy this nation. He's going to put it into captivity"? Would the people of the United States do as Nineveh did and fast, put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them even to the least of them? Would that happen? Well, there's a verse we'll cover in just a moment from Matthew where Jesus Christ talks about these people of Nineveh compared to the generation that existed at the time of Christ. And I'm sad to say, but I believe that that generation is very similar to the generation that exists today. Only this generation may be even worse than the one that existed at the time of when Christ was on this earth. But let's go quickly to the next few verses I have. Jonah 4, verse 11. Excuse me. When Jonah was upset that God was going to spare Nineveh, well, God talked to Jonah and said, "Should I not spare Nineveh, that great city wherein are more than 60,000 persons?" That would be, a score is 20, so 6 times 20, more than 120,000 persons that cannot discern between their right hand and their left hand, and also much cattle in that great city. So God talked with Jonah to help him, to try to help him understand why he was sparing Nineveh at that time. But then later, the people of Nineveh went back into their wickedness, and even worse, because in the first verse of the first chapter of Nahum, God has it worded, the burden of Nineveh. The book of the vision of Nahum, the Elkoshite. Now, when a verse starts out with the burden of Nineveh, now the wickedness of Nineveh has risen to a much higher level, perhaps the level of the time when God decided to bring the flood in Noah's days. But there are one or two other places where the prophecy against Nineveh after Jonah appears. One is here in Nahum 3 and verse 7, "And it shall come to pass that all they that look upon you shall flee from you, and say, Nineveh is laid waste. Nineveh is laid waste. Who will bemoan her? Whence shall I seek comforters for you?" And then in Zephaniah 2 in verse 13, "And he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and will make Nineveh a desolation and dry like a wilderness." And friends, that's the condition of Nineveh today. Now, Nineveh, where you see it on the map today, it's actually moved west. The capital, when the king of Assyria was there, was on the east side of the Tigris River. Now you see Nineveh on the west side of the Tigris River. So it's a little different, but it's still, for the most part, a vast desert wilderness there. But then this verse I've mentioned to you that I would tell you about from Matthew, where Christ exclaimed, "The men of Nineveh shall," and he's talking about the men of Nineveh during the generation of Jonah's time, "shall rise in judgment with this generation and shall condemn it, because they repented." The generation that existed during Jonah's time repented at the preaching of Jonas, and behold, a greater than Jonah is here. And yet the people had become worse, had waxed worse as time went on after Jonah down to the time of Christ. Okay, friends, I'm sorry, my voice has gone sore on us here. Maybe if I can get these slides to go back without hanging up our video player, so that we can play you the news stories that I have some video on. In closing, that was a funny video. That was a funny slide from a news story that where Hilary Clinton exclaimed, "We were dead broke." $10 million in debt when she and Bill Clinton left the White House. Most people, friends, most Americans, they try to live within their budgets, but some people have this philosophy that, hey, you can, we're dead broke, we're $10 million in debt. They can live way above their means, and yet then they take a $15 million advance for writing a book and over $100,000 for a speaking engagement. All that's in a certain different news story, but I don't want to get into too much of the political side of things. So let's go back to where we left off. Excuse me. Here's a still picture from Iraq when the fighting by the insurgents broke out yesterday. Now, yesterday I brought you a story, friends, from Germany about a cave rescue in progress. And I brought you, the more important story I brought you was a big storm there, a violent storm in which 6 people were killed. It battered cities in western Germany overnight. The same weather system was responsible for storms which hit a music festival in the Netherlands and in France. Hailstones the size of golf balls were reported. So that storm was not just isolated to Germany, and we had a big thunderstorm in Birmingham, but in the Netherlands and in France. In France, they had hailstones the size of golf balls. Verity Wild has this report on it.
The storms came after a bank holiday weekend of hot and sunny weather. Worst hit was Western Germany, where several people died. Trees were brought down and public transport was disrupted. In the Netherlands, festival goers at the Pink Pop event were drenched. Other areas were also hit by lightning. In France, hailstones as large as golf balls fell in this small town near Paris. This man said the noise was like a war. While another resident was woken up by the sound of her car windows being broken by the hailstones.
Okay, friends, pretty violent weather over there, and that weather relates to, let's put this slide up real quickly. That weather relates to the 4th seal. You'll see on this chart, Jesus Christ in plain language described the activities between famine and the Great Tribulation. Between the 3rd and 5th seal, he described it in 3 different ways, in 3 different Greek terms. He described it as loimus, meaning disease epidemics, pestilence, the plagues of Egypt. That's the primary thing of this seal. But he also described it as seismic activity, commotions in the air, such as gale force winds of all kind, including these violent storms with hailstones, and commotions on the ground, earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanic eruptions and that kind of thing. And the third term he used was tarake, trouble. Just trouble, like troubled waters, mobs, seditions. Not the great mega trouble of the 5th seal, but trouble. And, excuse me, I'm having a little 4th seal trouble with my throat here tonight. Friends, our next story, we're going to go over time just a few minutes tonight. I got a couple other things I think from today's news I think you'll want to know. It's normally would be a political type of thing, but because of the impact that it may well have, I want to share this story with you. The U.S. House Majority Leader Eric Cantor has lost a Virginia Republican Party primary election to a challenger from the hard-right Tea Party movement. Little-known economics professor David Bratt defeated the second-ranking House of Representative member 56 to 44%. Mr. Cantor had been widely favored to win, having raised significantly more money than Mr. Bratt. I believe you'll hear the amounts in this video. The BBC's David Willis says the result proves that the Tea Party is far from on its last legs.
He had outspent his opponent, Mike, 10-1, roughly. Eric Cantor, as you say, is the second most powerful member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He's the House Majority Leader, and he was seen as a possible successor to the House Speaker, John Boehner. Well, he's been defeated tonight in this primary, this Republican primary, by a man that few people had heard of before. He's an economics professor, Dave Bratt, causing a considerable upset here. This is a huge victory for the Tea Party at a time when a lot of political commentators here have been saying, Mike, that the movement itself was in retreat.
Well, on that particular point, as you were saying, a lot of analysts have been suggesting that. Is this an indication that that's not true, or is this specifically something to think about, Mr. Cantor?
Well, I think what it does is it throws the whole race for the midterms up in the air, if you like, with just a few months to go. November, we see the midterm elections. Here you have evidence that the Tea Party movement is far from on its last legs. If it can unseat a politician of the stature of Eric Cantor, then many people here are saying that it may now experience something of a resurgence. The Tea Party, of course, is not a political party. It's a movement. It's a conservative movement, a grassroots movement, if you like, which favours reduced government spending. Its members, of course, were vehemently against President Obama's healthcare reform measures. Well, now, as I say, going into those midterm elections, there's everything to play for as far as the Tea Party movement is concerned. And I think what this also does is it makes the prospect of reaching across the aisle of compromise between Republicans and Democrats all the more difficult.
Friends, last month, President Vladimir Putin of Russia signed a 30-year gas deal with Beijing, as we reported here. But Russia is increasingly looking to boosting its relations with China. Here with an opinion on this is the global chief economist at consultancy firm IHS with an opinion.
In terms of the Russia pivot and Russia as a supplier of natural gas, I think Asia is quite interested. Natural gas prices in Asia are probably about twice what they are in Europe, 4 times what they are in the U.S. So any source of relatively inexpensive natural gas, and Russia is such a source, will be welcomed. So that's one thing. The ruble is an entirely different story. The ruble is not a very strong currency. It's a very limited kind of currency. So my guess is the Asians will not be receptive to paying in rubles. They'll be happy to pay in dollars or in yuan, but not in rubles.
Because there are reports right now, Mr. Baravesh, that large Russian companies are preparing to switch contracts and use various products such as the yuan, as you mentioned, and other Asian currencies. Do you see that happening?
I think it will happen, but I'm guessing it's going to happen on a limited basis. It's not going to be a pervasive kind of change. I think this is more symbolic, with essentially the Russians saying, you know, so the West doesn't like us, we've got other friends in the world kind of thing. It's more that kind of an attitude. But I don't view this as a pervasive switch. I think the dollar will still be the denomination for energy contracts of all kinds.
Do you think, Mr. Baravesh, right now we're seeing many Asian companies having close relations with the West, the UK, Germany, and the United States. Could the West put pressure on some of these Asian economies not to do business with the Russians as a result of these sanctions?
I think there is a concern on the part of the Americans and the Europeans that somehow or other that China and the rest of Asia might give Russia an escape hatch, if you will, in terms of these sanctions. So I think the Americans and the Europeans are watching this very carefully to find out if indeed that's going to happen. If it does happen, or there's a worry that it might happen, then we might start to see more pressure on the Asian governments.
Okay, friends, we're watching any and everything that can have impact upon Europe deciding to come together more strongly and move us into the fifth seal. Friends, last night we closed with a story related to an injured man being trapped in Germany's deepest cave system. And we've got a follow-up report we'll close with on that tonight.
The caves under this spectacular landscape are called the Riesending, German for giant object, an indication of the scale of the underground labyrinth. There are miles of caves, some barely wide enough for a person to pass through. The 52-year-old explorer was hit on the head in a rock fall 1,000 meters underground. A team of Swiss cave rescuers has been called in.
Das Team Schweiz 1 ist mittlerweile beim verunfallten Orten angekommen.
Team Switzerland 1 has meanwhile reached the injured person. They were able to set up a communication system, the so-called cave link system, which is a long-wave radio system, so we have a radio connection.
The injured person is suffering from head injuries, but he is responsive. He can stand up with help. The complex of caves in the Alps is high on the border between Germany and Austria. But the real difficulty for rescuers is the sheer scale of the drops within the mountain. Caves fall sometimes for 300 meters, straight down, so climbers have to be lowered on ropes. And then 1,000 meters below the surface, the caves stretch horizontally to the injured man. Rescuers have set up a medical and communication station halfway down. The plan now is to bring him slowly, stage by stage, to the surface, but that will take days. Stephen Evans, BBC News, Germany.
And friends, that's it for our report tonight on this Wednesday night. God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll be back again tomorrow night, Thursday evening, with the day's current news related to the Bible and prophecy, and sometimes some interesting things too, here on Nightcast. Until next time, your host, Stephen Lloyd, saying good night, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.